this figure, which eventually will show up, this figure is one way of thinking about what's happened over the last 50 years in terms of cities. What I've done is I've taken all of the countries in the world with per capita incomes below $5,000, and I've sorted them on the basis of their income levels, correcting, of course, for inflation. And each one of these bars shows the share of countries in each income group that is more than one-third urbanized. The choice of one-third urban is relatively arbitrary, but gives you a sense as to whether or not these countries are typically urban or not. So if you look at the bars between $4,000 and $5,000, they tell you that both in 1960 and in 2010, roughly 80% of countries with between $4,000 and $5,000 per capita income are more than one-third urban. If you go to 3,000 to 4,000, in fact, almost every country in 1960 was more than one-third urban, and also a very high proportion today. But go down to the poorer countries. Ask yourself, look at the graph, what share of countries in 1960 with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more third urban? It's a really easy number to remember. The number is 0, none. For indeed, in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of recorded history, to be poor was to be rural. And this is an amazing shift, and is the shift that all of us are grappling with. That in fact, cities are places that can provide pathways out of poverty into prosperity. They are the best hope we have for transforming the economies of the developing world. But right now, we are confronting mass urbanization in places that are both poor and often poorly governed. And consequently, dealing with the downsides of density, dealing with the externalities that exist when human beings cram next to each other, is a first-order task for the developing world if these cities have any chance of fulfilling their destiny. One way of thinking about cities is they combine a triad. They rest on 3 poles, one of which is the magic of human interaction. And yes, that is about the chains of collaborative creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits, from Athenian philosophy to Facebook. But it's also about ordinary exchange. It's about the magic of entrepreneurship in the slum of Dharavi. It's about everything that happens that's positive when people come together. It's about the idea that the great English economist Alfred Marshall had when he talked about how in dense clusters the mysteries of the trade are no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. But of course, it's also about the physical city, right? Too often, urban planners and architects seem to think that the physical city is the real city, and it is not. The real city is the humanity that is brought together by density. But the physical city also matters. And figuring out how to deal with infrastructure is also a first-order problem. Right? And it brings up problems that are both involving engineering and institutions, right? What's the right institutional model? Eduardo Engel has told us that PPPs work perfectly well in Chile, but less successfully in sub-Saharan Africa. Nonprofits and independent public authorities are also tools for dealing with infrastructure. And then, of course, the third leg of this is these downsides of density. And this is the primary role of the public sector within cities, is to actually mediate crime, contagious disease, high housing costs, congestion. Cities often have tremendous amounts of inequality. And I've long argued that cities should not apologize for their inequality, because cities don't make people poor, at least not most of the time. They attract poor people with the promise of economic opportunity, with a better social safety net. But an abundance of poor, crowded people create enormous challenges for urban government. And those challenges are, in many senses, the great task of the 21st century. Now, I don't want you to get a sense from the first graph that the relationship either across countries or within countries between urbanization and income has in any sense decreased. Yes, we've had a rise of poor world urbanization, but the link, and this is the link across countries between urbanization and incomes, remains stronger than it ever has been. Moreover, if we go back to 1960, we just compare among poorer countries, we look at the relationship between the 50-year growth rate after 1960 and initial urbanization. It's a robustly positive relationship. This does not mean to suggest that I think in any sense that government policy should force people off of farms into cities. I think at the national level, the best policy is spatial neutrality, is maintaining an attitude towards space that is balanced. But the attitude that you hear in far too many places of power, that the right way to respond to the crowding and the difficulties of urban life is to just keep the poor people home on their farms, that is surely wrong, for there is no future in rural poverty. And on top of this, one of the striking facts that comes out from the happiness data is that while in rich countries there's no obvious difference between urban and rural happiness, in fact, New Yorkers typically say that they're not very satisfied with their life, although I would argue this has more to do with New York culture than it does with anything real, as no self-respecting New Yorker would tell an interviewer that they're satisfied with their life. It's like admitting to being an idiot. And in fact, suicide rates are quite low in New York. But at the same time, if you look at poorer places, there are huge happiness gaps. So in India, which one thinks of as being in some sense the font of anti-urbanism, it's hard to think of anyone who was more anti-urban than Gandhi. India has huge happiness gaps, and they favor the cities, not rural areas. Now, one of the challenges with doing empirical work on developing world megacities is data. And one of the things that's exciting is that we're beginning to get sources from a bunch of different private sources, be it M-Pesa or Zona, the wire transaction services, or even just visuals that give us a new way of looking into developing world cities. I'm just going to say a little bit about some work that I'm doing with Nikhil Naik, a computer scientist at MIT, which is using Google Street View to measure urban life. So one thing that you can do is essentially you have these pictures. If you then have a survey with income and GPS coordinates, you can then essentially regress income on the pixels, and you form a predicted income, and you can use that anywhere you have pictures. How well does this prediction work? We've done this for New York City, and the R-squared is over 80%. So you can explain 80% of the variation across New York with the pixels across areas. And the pictures also give us the possibility of measuring street quality, measuring whether or not the garbage has been picked up, measuring the presence of open sewers. All of these things can be done in ways using new technology that are incredibly exciting. Now, we have some hints in the ways that we deal with density from the past of the West. This is the death rates in New York City from 1800 to today. And death and the city have gone together for centuries. A boy born in Elizabethan London or in 1900 New York could expect to live 7 years less than the national average because of contagious disease. These cities did not become safe by accident. They did not become safe easily. And they did not become safe just because of infrastructure, although infrastructure was important. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And yet infrastructure is not everything. And you can see this by looking right there, or right over there, is the date in which New York's great engineering achievement, the Croton Aqueduct, was built. And I was raised on a story of engineering triumphalism in which this great aqueduct was built and then the clean waters came in and then New York was safe. A quick look at this graph shows you that's a lie. Right? 1842, anyone see a trend break in 1842? Anyone see sort of any massive gap? Of course not. Precisely because for 25 years after this, New York suffered from the same last mile problem that still afflicts sub-Saharan Africa today. They built the aqueduct, they charged for connections, and poor people didn't connect. They still used the shallow wells and the boreholes, and they still died. My own 5-greats-grandfather died in the 1849 cholera epidemic in New York City. It wasn't until after 1866 they started charging people, they started requiring that landowners connect to the sewers, connect to the water, that you actually got this transition to move. You needed both incentives and infrastructure to get this to work. And of course that lesson, which is you need some sort of a combination of incentives and infrastructure, raises challenges for the developing world. In part because you don't necessarily trust the cops to impose penalties on people who don't connect, in part because you're worried about the social justice of imposing penalties on poorer people, and in part because you don't know who owns the land. Right? And it reminds us that, in fact, property is not just about empowering the owners, to Soto's point. It's also about imposing obligations on the owners. This is an old German proverb that sort of property is also about obligations. And indeed, until we have title well defined, we can't expect to impose obligations like getting rid of open pit latrines in people's backyards. The same point about incentives and infrastructure goes in roads. Right? There's something that the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner have identified called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which is that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Right? The only way to deal with this is with congestion pricing, is with some form of charging people for the social costs of their actions. Singapore has been doing this for 40 years since they were a poor country. Right? In many cases, it's politically impossible to imagine congestion pricing everywhere, but if you're going to build a new road where you typically can get away with imposing a charge, put a price on it from the beginning. Get people used to the idea that roads are not free, they're not in some universal Bill of Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt never said that highways needed to be free for everyone. Okay, let me skip over this. In many cases, when we're looking at dealing with the demons of density, we're looking at a tale of two technologies. We're looking at one technology, like jitneys, that are cheap and inexpensive, and a second, like the GO train in Johannesburg, that is incredibly expensive. In many cases, the right question is to figure out what balance of these two technologies do you want. In some cases, like sewers, you want to move everyone from the cheap technology, the pit latrines, to the expensive technology of sewers. In the case of buses, that's almost surely not true. Right? The right answer is not to build fancy trains everywhere. Right? The Curitiba innovation in bus rapid transit is surely right. And in other areas, like Istanbul, we've seen tremendous success, which has come from upgrading the system. And improved electronic communication make it possible to upgrade more things. In other areas like crime, we get innovations by thinking about the marketplace that creates crime. You can sell drugs or anything else in two models. A dentist model where you know your provider, and a supermarket market model where you just go to a place and buy the drugs. The supermarket model, the local area where you buy drugs, is a recipe for murder. Because in fact, gangs will fight over this turf because they get the customers that go there. when you go with a dentist model, you don't get the dentist customers if you kill the dentist, right? Just as you don't get the dealer's customers if you kill the dealer. Consequently, it's much less prone to creating violence. And so either way can sell drugs, right? One way is a lot safer than the other. The final point I want to make is that when it comes to building, there are two twin perils, a Scylla and Charybdis, if you will, of NIMBYism, saying no to far too many things, and monumentalism, which is the great mistake of thinking that the city is the structures. India, Mumbai, suffers from terrible NIMBYism inherited from the British Town and Country Planning Act of 1948, right? Saying no to everything, average floor area ratios of 1 1/4. China, by contrast, has suffered from a monumental wave of monumentalism, building large towers that were totally unfit for the current residents of the area and wasting billions, if not trillions of dollars in the process. The goal is to allow enough freedom around building for private entrepreneurs to build the kind of buildings that people want and to provide infrastructure that is well targeted to what people need. Now, I just want to end by saying that these challenges are enormous, but the promise is incredible. And as such, I cannot think of a higher calling, a higher vocation than working to make the cities of the developing world livable, humane, and places of great opportunity for their residents. Thank you.